Hello and welcome to Crohn's Corner. I'm Whitney. I'm one of the readers here at Earth and Soul, and I'm also a hospice nurse. So, what I've been mulling around lately, and I did a previous video on the concept of death positivity. And so what I've been mulling around lately is the changes that have come to dying and grieving related to the pandemic that we're experiencing. So if you've had a loss in your life during this pandemic, especially, so much condolences to you. It's a difficult event and it's a difficult process under the best of times, and the restrictions related to the pandemic have made funeral arrangements and grieving all the harder. And if you haven't had a loss, or if you don't have anyone in a nursing home, you may not be aware of the changes that we're currently under. But nursing homes have restricted visitation to their residents. That includes families. Families are, at the worst, outright banned, regardless. And at the best that I've seen, restricted to maybe 2 people at a time for 20 minutes at a time. And that's based on epidemiological evidence that the more time that you're present in potential exposure to COVID-19, the more likely you are to contract the illness. And also, the more people who are exposed to one another, the more likely that one of them may be a carrier and expose everybody to it. So there's some science behind these regulations, but ultimately where rubber meets the road, people are dying alone. Most nursing homes, but not all of them, are allowing family to visit when their resident is imminently dying, and that's generally thought of as predicting that death is going to occur within a week. It might be fewer days than that, but generally it's around a week. And at least one nursing home that I've been involved in a death wasn't allowing family in at all. And so, just as a side note, in that case, I checked with the family to see if they would want to do a viewing outside the nursing home on the gurney before the deceased was loaded into the hearse, and they agreed that that was preferable to not having a visitation at all. And so I coordinated that with the funeral home. For the most part, though, families are allowed in if somebody is actively dying. And then from the nursing home, from the hospice side of things, some facilities are restricting us entirely unless there's an emergency that they call us for. And the majority are allowing hospice nurses and hospice aides in, but restricting and banning social workers and chaplains. There's not any nursing homes in the area that I'm aware of that aren't having restrictions of some sort. So that's the nursing home situation, and then the funeral home situation is pretty much the same thing. Most of the funeral homes are allowing visitation, but restricted amount of time and restricted number of people. Some of the funeral homes are not doing services at all at this time and not allowing viewings. So a situation that's difficult anyway has now been made impossible in many circumstances. So, what I've been recommending families lately is for them to keep their deceased in the home, um, you know, hours if necessary. And we always tell people not to call the funeral home until everybody is ready for them to come and collect the deceased. And usually people are ready, within an hour, maybe two. But more and more, I've been encouraging people. I've been in hospice in 3 different states, and in none of those states were there regulations saying that the body had to be removed from the location within X number of hours. It's kind of mind blowing, but there really isn't. Common sense and science would say that it's a good thing to remove a body within a few hours or put the body on ice. And so that's what we recommend if a body's going to be laid out in a home for greater than 24, 48 hours. Most cases, over 48 hours, not really anybody's wanting to keep a body around that long. The people who come from cultures where wakes are celebrated are very familiar with laying out a body in the home and how to go about it safely and maintaining everybody's safety. And those of us who didn't come from traditions like that might need to look into what it takes, because this is definitely an option that's becoming more and more palatable in the current situation. Usually how hospice works at a death is that the nurse who's responding to pronounce is the one who takes control of the situation, so the family can just process their emotions, process what's going on. So I will generally be the person who calls the funeral home when the family's ready. But these days, if the family is open to it, I've been suggesting that they be the ones to call the funeral home when they're ready, with the understanding that once the deceased is in the funeral home, the family doesn't really have a lot of control over what happens at that point. The funeral home has regulations that they have to put into place. And there's no reason that a deceased can't stay in the home for 24 hours even. So that's a big change that has come about just in the last couple of weeks as far as my practice goes. And no doubt there'll be other changes that occur in how we celebrate our funerals and how we mourn. So thinking about all of this and thinking, okay, what does this mean going forward? How is our paradigm changing with death and dying, celebrating, mourning? And everybody has a vague idea about why we do these things, but to me it was just, vague, floaty outy kinds of, well, it's important. So I did a little research to try to get it to be a little more concrete. And so the reasons that we do recognize our dead and have rituals of mourning in our traditions is, number one, to support the bereft, the people who have experienced the loss. It's pretty much human nature for us to isolate when we feel that vulnerable emotionally, and that's not a good thing to do. So just by our human nature and the development of our traditions, we have come up with rituals to support the bereft. Another important part of funerals and other means of recognizing a death is to enhance the acceptance that the death occurred. If you've had a significant loss in your life, you may be familiar with that feeling. I describe it as a vacuum. A vacuum opens up. as a medium myself, usually I should say, when I go into a home, I can feel, and it feels like a vacuum because the soul has departed. So, if you've had that loss, you've probably felt that, a big hole in your experience has opened up. And it takes a while for that hole to fill back up to a point where things feel normal again. Funerals and other rituals that we do help that process along. And also recognizing our loved ones' deaths, having these rituals helps our acceptance of our own mortality as well. We have a huge tendency in Western civilization, modern, I should say, Western civilization, to deny our mortality, pretend that, it's not even pretending, it's just a subconscious immortality that we live in. And every death that occurs of meaning to us is a chance to remember we're mortal, this incarnation will come to an end. And so what does that mean for us? Funerals give us a chance to reflect on those if we'll be brave and open and do that. So as we reflect on our own mortality, being confronted by the deaths of our loved ones, it's an opportunity for our personal growth and our opportunity to reflect on our lives. It's going to be us on the deathbed one day, if we're fortunate. And I say fortunate enough to have a deathbed, because we all know that there's other deaths that don't have that. But when coming to an acceptance of our own mortality, it gives us an opportunity to really reflect on, well, so what do I want to do with this time that I have before I don't have the time anymore? So all of that and more are some very compelling reasons to think about our dying, think about death, celebrate our loved ones who've passed on. And what I'm leading up to is develop new rituals, because the rituals that we've had in place are being deconstructed by this virus and our response to this virus. And a big part of me says, way to go, coronavirus, because many of our rituals haven't really been that effective in causing us to reflect and to give us these opportunities for personal growth, giving us opportunities to come to meaningful acceptance of our loss. And so time to rethink all of that. And when I say that the current traditions, I'm painting with a broad brush. I know there are rituals that are deeply meaningful, but I think what I'm thinking of in those terms, and this is going to reflect my bias, I'm very aware of that, but I'm thinking in terms of making a corpse look as natural as possible. To me, a natural-looking corpse, having been around people as they die and after they've died, to me a natural corpse is corpse in appearance. The color is dusky or pale or yellowish and kind of waxy. Many times, depending on the events leading up to the death, the body is almost skeletal because of weight loss from the disease process. Dark circles, sunken eyes, open mouth, open eyes that are just staring and not focusing. Those are the things that a corpse looks like. And I've been to one funeral personally where there had been no embalming. It was an open casket viewing. There'd been no embalming and no makeup applied. that was a corpse. It was another nurse I worked with, and he was Native, and I think that was significant to the choice of funeral arrangements. And I saw him in the casket and thought, yes, that looks very final, and that looks, that's real. That's the reality of a deceased person's appearance. And it was still open casket. There was still a procession, and the mourners contributed little items that were significant to their relationship with the deceased, like feathers, books they knew that he had enjoyed, different things like that. The casket was like a bin at the thrift shop after they were done. And for me personally, that was very significant, because I'm like, yeah, that's this. That's, that's what a deceased person looks like, and those are tangible objects of remembrance and connection. So I'll just share my personal bias, and you don't have to agree. People need what they need to grieve and to come to acceptance. For me personally, it doesn't help me grieve. It doesn't help me come to acceptance to have a made-up body trying to look like 20 years earlier in the person's life, especially. And I'll use a counter to the previous funeral. I've been to a funeral, and the makeup was gaudy, and it was not at all what she would have used on herself. And her husband was not able to attend because he was in the hospital from the same motor vehicle accident. And so, he wanted to know the details from everybody who attended, and I just said to him, I'm so glad I had that time with her, and another family member died in the same accident. And I said, I'm really glad that I had that time with them in the funeral home before the funeral. And I just left it at that. Hello, Rhonda. And because, it's not going to serve anybody to say, oh, it was just hideous, but it was hideous. But then other people who were mourning the family felt that it was, beautiful and really helped them grieve. So it's very individualized. I get that. I'm just sharing my my worldview. So some funeral homes are no longer embalming unless it's legally required. And that's because of the potential for exposing the funeral workers to infectious disease that aerosolizes. And back to all the restrictions on the visitation, more and more we're learning about how coronavirus transmits, and it does hang in the air for several hours in an infectious state. And so anything that can aerosolize or send these droplets of body fluids that contain the virus into the air is potentially hazardous to the people around it. So limited embalming. And I'll say as an aside, and here we go again with I don't like corpses to try to look like living people anymore. But embalming is never legally required, with the exception of some states require embalming before a body can transfer across state lines. I know the state of Washington, where I've done hospice, well, I don't know about embalming, come to think of it, but in Washington, special paperwork has to be filed before a body can even cross a county line. Most airlines, if not all of them, require embalming for a body to be transported on one of their airplanes. So it's very limited that embalming is required, as shown by the funeral where the corpse looked like a corpse, hadn't been embalmed, it is not required for a viewing. And that's just a matter of a family's sensitivities and taste, whether they would embalm for a viewing. Not required. So I think embalming is going to be less of a thing in the future. The other side of embalming is some of the most toxic, hazardous chemicals known are the chemicals that are involved in embalming. Foremost is formaldehyde, and it's very carcinogenic. And it doesn't stay in the person's body when the person's buried. And cremation after embalming releases these chemicals into the air. So personally, again, my worldview, and you don't have to agree with it, but personally I'm for good riddance to embalming, except under very limited circumstances. I'm all for that paradigm shift. How we've gotten to where we are with funerals and memorial services and dying and talking about it is kind of an interesting little brief history. Before the plague in Europe, the dead were cared for by their families, and specifically the women in the family. And that still holds up. The women in the family are still the vast majority of the caregivers. There are some sons, husbands doing fantastic care of their dying family members, but they're the minority. It's generally a woman's responsibility or viewed as such. So before the plague, families laid out their dead, cleaned their dead, and took care of disposition of the body, so burial. Side note to burial, I know in Idaho, another one of the states that I did hospice, and in Oklahoma, I'm not sure about Washington because it didn't come up, but if you own private land and you get the paperwork signed off on, you can bury your dead on your land. You don't have to go through a funeral home other than, anything needed for the paperwork to be finalized. So that's an option for people who don't want to do cremation with the toxins in the air, very high carbon footprint to cremation because they have to fire up the crematorium for each individual body, cool it down, clean it out, fire it back up again for the next body. At least that's if they're going to do it legally, and we won't get into the funeral homes that have gotten into big trouble for not doing it that way. So lots of fuel used, big carbon footprint to cremation. So the people who want to avoid all the toxins of embalming, the vaults in cemeteries to allegedly protect the land from all this imaginary hazard from decomposing bodies, or embalming to prevent the or slow down the decomposition in the first place. There is an alternative, definitely, if you own your own land. I would say, though, if that's something that you think you would prefer, look into research the process for that well ahead of time. That's a gift you can give your survivors, to have all of that in place, if that's what your desire is. So the plague came along, and just like now in some parts of the world, some parts of the U.S., the location gets overwhelmed with potentially infectious bodies that or overwhelming the the ability of people in the community to properly dispose of the bodies, leading to further exposure to the pathogen in question. So after the plague, dealing with the deceased became more of an organized activity versus just kind of laissez-faire in the home by the families. And then we've got Victorian times. Excuse me. I'll wash my hands after this, I promise, and I won't touch anything. Victorian times, society became very interesting around death and dying. It's a really interesting time if you're, as mortician Caitlin Doherty says, death aficionado. I consider myself a death aficionado, or as she likes to say, my deathlings, to her audience on her podcast. Her podcaster Ask the Mortician. So any questions you have that you're afraid to ask, she gets your question and much worse, I promise you. So very interesting time, and this is the rise of memento mori, which is anything that usually like jewelry or different kinds of art that remind us of our mortality. Very often it's around a significant death, and so specific to the person who has died, including hair jewelry. I don't know how many of you know about hair jewelry, but we actually have articles of hair jewelry in my family from ancestors during that period. And some of them can be very intricate. Ours aren't so much. Ours are like, woven human hair in a brooch, that sort of a thing. But there can be elaborate pictures that you would hang on the wall, all constructed out of a loved one's hair, sculpted into scenes, landscapes, still lifes, all made out of human hair. It seems really crazy to modern sensibilities, but that was a very significant way to spend time thinking about the death. And that's an important part of ritual, is to give us the time and the space to reflect on the deceased, to reflect on the dying process, to reflect on our own deaths and our lives even. So Victorian period is kind of the golden age of death and mourning in Western culture anyway. And after the Victorian period came the rise of science, and I'll further share my biases. It kind of, to me, mimics the rise of medical intervention with birth. I'm not at all saying that births shouldn't be medically managed. I'm an old OB nurse and a high-risk OB nurse, and I've seen pretty horrendous things that really needed to be managed by a physician with a physician's training in a hospital setting. But, long story short, applying science to birth shifted the power from the family, the home, community women who were experienced as midwives, and shifted it to, at the time, a male, I won't even say male-dominated, medicine was male then. And the same occurred with death as well. The women of the home were too sensitive to deal with these dead bodies. And, the danger of that dead body, bacteria. We've learned that there's a thing called bacteria. And I don't think they had learned about viruses yet, but oh, we've got to protect the community from these dangerous dead bodies. Again, I'm a little bit of a fangirl for Caitlin Doherty, and she just blows that myth wide open. And it makes a lot of sense. If a pathogen occurs in living tissue and could be contracted by a living mourner or a living funeral industry, and I include hospice in that, if that pathogen lives in living tissue, they don't tend to live on dead tissue. And the organisms that do thrive on dead tissue, part of the decomposition process, don't like living tissue. You know, we fight those things off. They're weak. They're so weak they have to have a dead host. So it's the majority of the time ridiculous to think of a dead body as a hazardous object. But science and the men of science of the time played off of, you know, the newer thinking about pathogens, bacteria, and developed a whole industry around protecting society from these hazardous dead bodies. And that's where we got embalming too. Oh, we've got to do formaldehyde to kill off the bacteria and the viruses living in that body. And the body's death kind of killed off most of them. And that's where we are now, with people like Caitlin Doherty and the Order of the Good Death, which is a group that she started to try to further death positivity and death awareness in our society. You know, going into the future, I'm really hoping that the death positivity movement gains some traction and we can get to a more natural, less anxious, calmer approach to death and dying, a more meaningful mourning. And here we are with the pandemic, giving us a wonderful opportunity to start changing these paradigms. So, back to mulling over all of this, I have a lot of time in my car between patients, just alone with my thoughts in the rolling Oklahoma landscape. And I started thinking about, well, what kinds of things can we do in this current environment to replace some of the standard practices in mourning and maybe enhance the dying journey as well for the person going through it. And so some of the things I've thought of, I'll back off. We're creative people, and